As the warm light of the evening faded into a blanket of stars, Jesus sat with his disciples beneath a quiet olive tree. Their faces were lined with the stress of the world, the burdens of imperfection, and as they gathered around him, he began a story that would unlock a deeper truth about emotional peace. Once upon a time, in the bustling heart of Jerusalem, lived a young scribe named Samuel. Samuel's hands had been trained since childhood to inscribe the sacred texts that preserved the wisdom of generations. He was known throughout the city as one of the finest scribes, for his handwriting was flawless, his attention to detail unmatched. Day after day, Samuel sat in his small room, illuminated only by the soft glow of candlelight, copying scripture onto rolls of parchment that would be carried to the temple. Though Samuel was praised for his work, there was a deep struggle inside him, a constant fear that gnawed at him, the fear of making a mistake. Each scroll felt like a test, and every letter had to be perfect. Samuel could not bear the thought of even the slightest error. He believed that one mistake would tarnish his work, would stain his worth. And so, his days were consumed by the pressure of perfection. In the beginning, this fear only crept in at the edges, but over time, it began to consume him. He would spend hours rewriting pages he thought weren't good enough. Every smudge of ink felt like a personal failure, and he grew increasingly anxious with each new scroll. The weight of his own expectations became unbearable, but Samuel kept pushing forward, believing that if only he worked hard enough, perfection could be achieved. One evening, as the festival of Passover approached, Samuel was given a great honor. The high priest asked him to copy the sacred scrolls that would be read during the most important ceremony in the temple. This was the opportunity Samuel had waited for his entire life. If he could create the perfect scroll, his name would be remembered among the greatest scribes of the land. The pressure weighed heavily on him. Day and night, Samuel worked tirelessly, his quill never leaving the page for more than a moment. The room around him was silent except for the faint scratching of his pen. His eyes burned from the strain, his hands ached from gripping the quill too tightly. But Samuel was relentless in his pursuit of perfection. As the final day of his work approached, Samuel carefully began the last section of the scroll. It was late at night, the moon high in the sky, casting a silver light through the window. His hand moved smoothly across the parchment, every stroke precise and measured. But then, in a moment of fatigue, his hand slipped. A small blot of ink fell from the tip of his quill, staining the page. Samuel froze. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the tiny imperfection. His heart began to race and his palms grew sweaty. That small mark on the page felt like a crushing blow. He had spent weeks on this scroll and now it was ruined. The mistake was small, nearly invisible to anyone else, but to Samuel, it was all he could see. His mind spiraled into panic. How could he present this scroll to the high priest with a flaw? What would they think of him? Would they see him as careless, unworthy of his position? Samuel's chest tightened with fear and frustration. He ripped the scroll from the table, crumpling it in his hands and threw it to the floor. Anger and despair filled his heart. How could something so small bring such failure? He had let everyone down, the temple, the high priest, and worst of all, himself. Samuel sank to the ground, his head in his hands, feeling utterly defeated. The candles flickered as his tears fell onto the crumpled parchment. The next morning, the city was alive with preparations for the festival. People moved through the streets, carrying goods and offering prayers, but Samuel felt none of the joy. His soul was heavy, weighed down by his self-imposed failure. He couldn't return to the temple with the ruined scroll. He couldn't face the high priest, knowing the imperfection would be seen. Desperate for guidance, Samuel made his way to the temple. There he sought out Nathanael, an old and revered teacher, known for his wisdom and humility. Nathanael had spent decades in the temple, writing scrolls and teaching young scribes like Samuel. His presence was calming, and his words carried the weight of years of experience. When Samuel found Nathanael, the old man was sitting quietly in the temple courtyard, the early morning light streaming down through the columns. Samuel approached slowly, his head bowed with shame. Without waiting for an invitation, Samuel sat beside Nathanael and poured out his heart. He told the old teacher about the mistake, about his fear of imperfection, and how it had destroyed everything he had worked for. Nathanael listened in silence, his kind eyes never leaving Samuel's face. When Samuel had finished, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his confession. Nathanael spoke in a voice that was gentle but filled with wisdom. "Samuel," he said, "you are like many young scribes who believe that perfection is the only measure of worth. But I will show you something." With that, Nathanael stood and led Samuel to a small, quiet room deep within the temple. The walls were lined with ancient scrolls, some of them so old that the parchment had begun to crumble at the edges. Nathanael carefully took down one of the scrolls, a sacred text that had been in the temple for generations, and handed it to Samuel. "Look at this," Nathanael said softly. Samuel unrolled the scroll, expecting to see a flawless work of art. But to his surprise, the scroll was far from perfect. There were smudges where ink had run, places where the scribe had crossed out words, and areas where the parchment had faded over time. Yet despite these imperfections, the scroll was revered, its wisdom unchanged. "How can this be?" Samuel asked, astonished. "This is one of the most sacred scrolls in the temple, but it is filled with mistakes." Nathanael smiled, his eyes twinkling with the knowledge of years. "Yes, this is a sacred scroll," he said, "but like life, it bears the marks of those who have written it. You see, Samuel, no scroll is perfect, just as no person is perfect. The value of this scroll is not in its flawless appearance but in the wisdom it carries. The smudges and mistakes do not take away from its message. It still brings light to those who read it." Samuel stared at the scroll, his heart swelling with realization. The imperfections he had feared so deeply, the smudges he thought would ruin everything, they didn't diminish the value of the scroll. They were part of its journey, part of its humanity. Nathanael placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder and continued, "Perfection is not the measure of your worth, Samuel. Emotional balance comes not from erasing every flaw, but from accepting them. Just as this scroll has brought wisdom despite its imperfections, you too have great value even with your mistakes. Your worth is not in the absence of flaws, but in the love, dedication, and light you carry within." Samuel felt tears welling up in his eyes. For so long, he had believed that any mistake made him unworthy, that perfection was the only way to prove his value. But now, standing before this ancient scroll, he realized that his worth was not defined by his mistakes. It was defined by the light he brought into the world, the love he put into his work, and the wisdom he shared with others. Nathanael smiled warmly at Samuel. "Emotional balance, my son, is not about controlling every outcome or avoiding every mistake. It is about accepting the imperfections of life and finding peace within yourself. The world may present you with storms, with challenges, with moments of failure. But if you carry peace in your heart, those moments will not defeat you." Samuel nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. The weight of his expectations lifted, and for the first time in a long while, he felt free. He realized that his pursuit of perfection had been like trying to control the wind, impossible and exhausting. But now, he understood that peace could be found even in the midst of imperfection, even in the smudges and mistakes. After leaving the temple, Samuel returned to his small home, the morning light casting long shadows across the streets. He walked with a lighter step, his heart filled with the wisdom Nathanael had shared. When he entered his room, he found the torn scroll lying on the floor where he had left it the night before. The parchment was crumpled, the ink smeared in places, but it was still there, waiting for him. Samuel picked up the scroll and smoothed it out on the table. He looked at the small blot of ink that had caused him so much despair the night before, and instead of seeing a mistake, he saw a part of the scroll's story. He smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle within him. He patched the torn edges and, with a steady hand, continued his work. Every letter he wrote after that felt like an act of grace. not striving for perfection but embracing the process, the journey, and the beauty in imperfection. In the days that followed, Samuel delivered the scroll to the temple, his heart lighter, his spirit more at ease. He no longer feared the judgment of others, for he had learned that his worth was not defined by a flawless performance but by the love and dedication he put into his work. And as the sacred scroll was read aloud during the festival, Samuel felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the wisdom he had written would guide others, imperfections and all. Jesus paused after finishing the story. The disciples, who had been listening intently, sat in thoughtful silence. Some had tears in their eyes, while others nodded slowly, as if the story had struck a deep chord within them. Jesus looked at them with compassion. "You see, my friends, like Samuel, many of you carry the burden of trying to be perfect. You strive to control every aspect of your lives, fearing that any mistake will diminish your worth. But I tell you this, emotional balance is not about perfection. It is about accepting the imperfections, the smudges, and the mistakes that are part of life. It is in those moments that grace can enter your heart." The disciples exchanged glances, the weight of Jesus' words sinking in. They had all struggled with their own fears of failure, their own imperfections. But now they understood that their value did not lie in being flawless. It lay in the love, the wisdom, and the light they carried within. Jesus smiled gently and continued, "You are not defined by your mistakes. You are defined by the love you carry, the wisdom you share, and the peace you bring into the world. When you stop fighting against your imperfections, when you accept them with grace, you will find peace in the midst of any storm. And in that peace, you will discover the strength to carry on, no matter how difficult the path may seem." The disciples sat in quiet reflection, their hearts lighter, their spirits calmer. In that moment, they felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that they could embrace their imperfections and still be vessels of light and wisdom. They realized that, like Samuel's scroll, they could carry the truth of God's love, even with their flaws. And with that understanding, they knew they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. This is end of the story. Comment Amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.